Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Jablow, VP of Marketing at Atana, and welcome to Compliance Talk. We're here today because retailers across the country have been asking questions about New York's new Safety Act and what it means if they have operations in New York. I'm thrilled to be joined by James Sporleder to address these questions. James brings something really special to this conversation. He spent years training elite Department of Defense units in survival skills. And for the past 20 years, he's been using that expertise to help Fortune 100 companies handle workplace safety challenges. Welcome, James.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Glad to have this conversation today. So let's get into it.
All right.
Who is impacted by this law?
Well, as it stands, the Retail Worker Safety Act applies to employees in New York who have 10 or more employees working in a retail setting.
So how does an organization know if they actually fall into this category of retail?
Yeah, the law focuses on traditional retail stores that sell customer goods at retail prices, typically to the public. So if you're a primary business involved in direct sales of goods as opposed to services, and you have a storefront, you likely fit that definition. Think about what the average person would call a retail shop: clothing boutiques, electronic stores, department stores, and so forth.
What unique challenges do retail workers face when it comes to workplace violence prevention and response?
Yeah, so retail workers are on the front line with the public. They handle cash transactions, they face high foot traffic, and often they work long or late hours. Unfortunately, tensions can escalate quickly in these settings over a variety of issues. Think of some of the masking issues that happened in retail establishments during the pandemic. And then you can just have the normal day-to-day frustrations that people experience when they come into these shops. Maybe they're dissatisfied with a product, or they're trying to return something. Maybe there's a long line. Maybe they're having a difficult day. In any event, emotions can run high and things can escalate quickly in these retail settings. And that's why the law specifically targets this sector within the marketplace. The setting inherently carries a higher exposure to potential conflict or violence.
So in that case, part of the law talks about de-escalation. So what is de-escalation, and why does this law require training on it?
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting development in the overall conversation surrounding workplace violence prevention, is that really de-escalation is a concept that's a little farther upstream in the prevention sequence than normally what we pay attention to. Oftentimes, workplace violence prevention training focuses on pre-incident indicators or behaviors of concern that often manifest prior to violence happening. But de-escalation is a little farther upstream in the prevention side of things. And that's because it's both a mindset and a set of interpersonal communication skills that are designed to help cool heated or expressive encounters with frustrated people. It's about recognizing the early signs of heightened verbal aggression and using active listening skills to keep situations from spiraling. Lawmakers recognize that retail employees can't always rely on security and managers to intervene immediately, so de-escalation training empowers them to handle tense customer interactions in the moment. And effective verbal de-escalation can significantly help to reduce the immediate risk of violence and can help foster a safer environment for everyone.
Absolutely. Besides de-escalation, what does the training need to cover, and how often does it need to be conducted?
Yeah, such an excellent question. Currently, the law requires annual interactive training that covers everything from general safety procedures to recognizing threats, reporting incidents, and extreme violence awareness, or what some people might call active shooter awareness. And the term of art today is actually active assailant awareness, because there could be generally different types of violence that's brought forward in these kinds of settings. If the amendment is signed, this might shift a bit for retailers under a certain size, specifically those with fewer than 50 employees, and they may have a different training cadence. But at its core, the training must be updated regularly and must remain interactive or hands-on in some form.
So we know that this timeline is coming up very soon. What exactly is the timeline for compliance?
Yeah, so if the bill were in effect exactly as it was signed in September of 2024. Most of the provisions would start on the 3rd of March. That's just a few weeks away, which is 180 days after the original signing date. If the amendment is signed, which we expect that it will be, the effective date is likely to shift out to the 2nd of June. But we're keeping a close eye on that official signature to confirm what effective date will actually be in place.
So knowing that this is coming, what should employers be doing now to get ready for the mandate?
Yeah, so the first step would be to assess what you currently have in place regarding workplace violence prevention. That includes any existing policies, training, or emergency response procedures that you might already have in place. Then identifying gaps becomes an important part of the next step. Looking for things like, do you have a specific policy or procedure to address threats against retail employees? And do you train retail employees on things like de-escalation? Also, it's important that you consider who handles the compliance aspect of this. HR, legal, and security teams will need to come together in a multidisciplinary effort to collaborate and craft a plan that's both practical, satisfies all the law's requirements. And being proactive now will save a lot of headaches later.
Definitely. But what happens to those employers who don't comply?
Well, this is always the case, right? Like most labor laws, non-compliance can lead to fines, penalties, or even legal action, especially if a workplace incident occurs and the employer is found lacking in the required preventative steps. And beyond the legal and the financial risks, there is a risk of damage to brand and reputation, not to mention the moral imperative that underpins issues like this. No organization wants to be labeled as ignoring employee safety. So it's in the employer's best interest to follow the law. And honestly, it's just good business to protect your workforce.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So what does the New York law require in the way of having a workplace violence prevention policy or plan in place?
Yeah, so this is very similar to the kinds of things that have been recently enacted in the state of California, which had a similar law, although it wasn't specifically targeted toward retail employees. The law mandates a written policy, and that policy has to identify potential risk factors, outline response procedures. It has to have a clear mechanism for reporting incidents and detail on how the employer plans to reduce or eliminate those risks. And this can include some physical security improvements like better lighting, maybe increased staffing at high risk times, or stricter protocols for handling cash. That's always an issue because the criminal element can come into play here and is considered part of workplace violence awareness and prevention. If the amendment is signed, there might be some specific language about how many translations you need to provide, and that may be limited to the 12 most common languages that are in the state. So when we think about putting together programs that train, let's say, for example, in an e-learning format, you may need to consider having those programs translated to other target languages, such as Latin American Spanish or French Canadian. Those kinds of Those kinds of considerations need to be included when you're thinking about training your staff.
So if employers don't have a plan in place or they need to develop one, where can they find the model template for the workplace violence prevention plan?
I think one of the most interesting aspects of this development here in the state of New York, and frankly in California too, is that the legislative component in both states actually is a little bit ahead of the administrative departments. So it seems as though these governmental bodies, the legislative and lawmaking bodies and the actual administration, so for example, the New York OSHA office, they're needing to come into sync. And this is a strong indicator of just how important workplace violence prevention is becoming in the conversation nationwide. And so right now, the New York Department of Labor is tasked with publishing a model policy, but it's not yet available. We expect that they'll finalize that once the amendment is signed, and they'll post an official template online. California actually did this. In the meantime, employers can reference existing workplace violence prevention frameworks or consult experts to help develop a draft that meets or exceeds the law's baseline. And I would refer people to the ASIS, American National Standard on Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention. That is a wonderful document to get your hands on and really dive into the details when it comes to setting up a model template for a workplace violence prevention plan and other really important guidelines on how best to move forward with prevention efforts and intervention efforts when and if those become a needed aspect of your overall response.
Well, one part of the law is this panic button requirement. What is that exactly?
As originally written, employers with 500 or more retail employees nationwide must provide panic buttons in the workplace by the 1st of January in 2027. And these buttons directly alert emergency services. But the amendment seems to be looking at a way to shape that issue a little more effectively, given the kinds of threats and risks that are inside of a retail mission profile or occupational profile. So they may come forward with an idea of a silent response button instead of a panic button. And frankly, I think that's a better way to frame that issue. And it alerts an internal response team first before going straight to law enforcement. And it may only apply to retailers with 500 employees in the state rather than nationwide. So we're just going to have to stay tuned for that additional clarity.
Definitely. The California law is broad, but this workplace violence prevention law in New York is limited to retail workers. So how likely is it that New York's going to end up broadening the scope of the law and including other industries?
Yeah. It's not uncommon for states to start with a targeted industry and then expand the requirements to other sectors later on. California and Washington and Oregon all did this by focusing on healthcare first. And so there have been mandates, legislative mandates in place for several years for the healthcare industry because they run such a high risk of coming into a place where violence might be part of what's happening to them in the execution of their duties. And actually, New York already has a law requiring public employers to have a workplace violence prevention policy in place. So while the focus now is on the private sector and within retail, I wouldn't be surprised if this legislation or amendments to the legislation in future sessions will broaden the scope to hospitality, healthcare, or other high contact or high risk industries.
Yes, so it would be smart for folks in other industries as well to be looking at this law in New York, the one that's passed in California, and others that are on the docket.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is, what we know from history over the last decade or so is that as California goes, as New York goes, it's not long before Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, all of these other states are going to fall into line here. Texas, I would even throw in there as well. So I think this is just part of the evolving conversation around workplace violence prevention, awareness and prevention, and intervention. And it's a good development. Really, I think what's powerful about that is as we have that conversation more and more, people become more comfortable thinking about a scary thing. Interpersonal violence is a very corrosive experience. People generally don't want to think about it. But as we talk about it in a way that's respectful and safe, then we can really get our arms around that. And frankly, I think we can start pushing prevention upstream further and further to get in front of this issue long before things, hopefully we can avert real tragedies, which are happening every year in our workplaces.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, James. I really appreciate your time today. I found this conversation incredibly helpful. And I'm sure that others that are trying to figure out how do I handle compliance with these laws or just stay up to speed into what is happening and may come down the pike, I'm sure they're all going to find this incredibly helpful. So thank you again.
You bet. It was my pleasure. And we'll look to keep you all updated as developments become available.